Hey guys, how's everyone doing today? If you've been here before, you know who I am. If this is your first time stopping by, thank you. My name is Barb, and this is Halfway to Sane, where we do true crime. Today's story is how 32-year-old Treva Joyce Throneberry, aka Brianna Rebecca Stewart, aka Stephanie Daniel Lewis, aka Emily Cara Williams, aka Tracy Smith, aka Leanne Davis, aka Cara Lewis, aka Leanne Kiley, convinced the world she was a teenage runaway again and again and again. It was a hot August afternoon in 1999. We were sitting at a booth at a Roxy Cafe. Her name was Brianna Stewart, and she was a 17-year-old runaway from Mobile, Alabama. Brianna bore none of the protective coloration, the dyed hair, the pierced septum, the typical street kid. Dressed in blue bib overalls and a striped blouse, she was respectful and demure, a country girl adrift on the streets of Portland. Over the next 2 hours, she proceeded to elaborate an incredible tale involving her mother's death, brutal molestation by a sinister Navajo stepfather, and a desperate cross-country journey at the age of 13 in search of her real father. Despite bouncing in and out of foster care since arriving in the Pacific Northwest, she had valiantly stayed in high school. Do you know how hard it is to do your homework under an awning when it's raining and you can't go to the shelter until 9 o'clock? She showed me a scrapbook crammed with photographs and smiley faces and told me how she joined the tennis team and how she took a date to homecoming. She showed me a copy of an ancient Romanian prayer worn at the creases that she kept as a memento of her albino grandfather. Brianna's immediate problem was that she had nothing to support her identity. No birth certificate, no medical records, no social security number, and the federal government would not issue her a new social security number unless she could track down her real parents or at least show evidence of their existence. She hoped a good reporter could solve the mystery and get a scoop at the same time. From my point of view, Brianna's story was a bust. It was just possible that a dogged investigation might turn up a clue to her past. But other agencies, including FBI, had already tried and failed. It was far more likely that I would rack up hundreds of dollars in telephone bills and come up empty-handed. I closed my notebook and suggested she try a lawyer. We shook hands and returned to our separate worlds. I to my office, and she to the streets of Portland. It turned out I was wrong. Brianna did have a compelling story. It just wasn't the one she was telling. There was no Navajo stepfather, no dead mother. The truth was far stranger. Brianna was arraigned in a Clark County, Washington court on 7 counts of theft and perjury. Prosecutors say she is not Brianna Stewart of Mobile, Alabama, but Treva Thornberry of Electra, Texas, and that she defrauded the state of Washington out of more than $15,000. Most amazing of all, they say she is not a homeless teenager, but a 32-year-old con artist who has concocted more than a dozen youthful identities and made repeated accusations of rape, often against the very people who tried to help her. News of Brianna's arrest stunned those who thought they knew her. My reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Most people are glad to get out of high school. A police officer stated, "I was flabbergasted to say the least." He reused Brianna from the street and took her into his... He rescued Brianna from the street and took her into his home. I was angry. She had caused a lot of strife in our family, and then she turned out to be a big fraud. It also stunned Clark County prosecutors. 3 years ago, they convicted a C-Trans security guard of statutory rape for having sex with Brianna in his car when she was supposedly only 17 years old. He served 50 days and lost his job because of the incident. The world has no shortage of imposters, most with predictable motives like money or to avoid the law or sometimes for the sheer thrill of the masquerade. Brianna's case is hard to explain. First, she had no clear motive. Second, she managed to hoodwink a platoon of professionals, skeptics, including cops, lawyers, reporters, and teenagers. She was so convincing, in fact, that she probably would never have been unmasked but for her insistence on solving the mystery of her origins. Third, despite a mountain of evidence identifying her as Throneberry, including fingerprints, photographs, and dental records, Brianna has never wavered from her story, even from her jail cell. All of which raises an unsettling question. Is it possible that Brianna Stewart is stuck on replay, doomed to reenact a fatal scenario whose prologue she has forgotten? In the spring of 1997, a 16-year-old girl materialized at the Glad Tidings Church where she repeated a tale she had told with variations many times before. She grew up outside Mobile, Alabama. Her mother died when Brianna was 7, after which she was raised by her stepfather, Alan Reeves, a Navajo Indian who worked for the sheriff's department. Alan Reeves had a He had a shady past. He once worked as a gun runner off the Ivory Coast and subjected her to the physical and sexual torture. When money ran low, he made pornographic videotapes of her. She tried to turn him into authorities when she was 13 years old, but nothing happened, so she ran away. With the desperate optimism of adolescence, she hitchhiked her way across the country in search for her real father, Michael Stewart of Vancouver, Washington, staying with friendly strangers along the way, working on farms, earning enough for bus fare from the dusty town to the next. When she finally arrived in the Portland area, she tracked down a Michael Stewart in Aloha. He wasn't her real father, but he let her move in with him. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a drug addict. He introduced her to crack and cocaine and kept her prisoner in his apartment. After a couple of months, she ran away and hit the streets, where she met a youth pastor for Glad Tidings who encouraged her to attend services. Brianna's story shocked and moved the congregation. Various church families let her stay with them until she could get back on her feet. The church receptionist, Debbie, said, "I knew she was homeless, and she said her parents were very cruel. We didn't want her to wind up back on the street, so we took her in." Debbie thought Brianna seemed old for her age. Whenever someone remarked that she looked older than 16 years old, Brianna got very upset. Brianna had one teenage trait down cold, however, a certain surliness toward parental authority. Over the next few months, tensions mounted at Debbie's home over chores and bedtime hours. Meanwhile, Brianna was engaged in one of the most brazen charades of her entire career. She persuaded officials at Evergreen High School to let her enroll as a sophomore, even though she was actually 28 years old. A classmate stated, "When I first saw her, I thought she was a teacher. Then she sat down at the desk like everyone else." "She looked older than the others," said an instructor who taught Brianna in psychology and sociology her senior year. But street kids often have a lot of miles on them. Fellow students were aware that Brianna had been on the streets, but in most other respects, she appeared to be an average student. She earned a GPA of 2.85. She joined the tennis team, and the high school librarian said she was a quiet person who blended in, a loner with no counseling problems. She was queen of the mall rats, said a classmate and an ex-boyfriend, an aspiring actor who met Brianna at the Sweet Factory early in her sophomore year. He never had a serious girlfriend before. Hang on 1 second, guys. This one wants to come up. Okay, he said, I was in love with her. They dated for almost 18 months, and in the beginning, Brianna was a positive influence. She even took him to services at Glad Tidings. He said they made out a lot, but never had sex. As time went by, however, the relationship became a burden. I would sit up and worry all night. She said people were following her, and I believed her. He was also disturbed by Brianna's bottomless appetite for Ritalin, prescribed for an attention deficit disorder. By May 1998, Debbie had reached the end of their tether. Strife about the chores continued, and Brianna's stories grew increasingly outlandish. She said her stepfather was involved in a satanic cult, and she was raised as a high priestess. She said a senator from the Midwest had gotten her pregnant while she was working on his re-election campaign. At night, Debbie said, your head would spin because it was so awful. Finally, after an argument over vacuuming the living room, Debbie and her husband gave Brianna 2 weeks to move out. Scrambling for shelter, Brianna persuaded caseworkers at the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services to put her in a foster home, using her student body card as documentation. That fall, however, Brianna's carefully crafted identity faced its first serious challenge when a dentist noticed that her wisdom teeth had been extracted and the scars fully healed. The dentist considered this so unusual for a 16-year-old that he shared his suspicions with Brianna's caseworker. She confronted Brianna, warning her that defrauding the foster care system was a crime. Brianna was not intimidated. She wrote a 5-page, single-spaced letter lambasting her caseworker. Although repeatedly written by a 16-year-old girl, the letter sounded more like a jailhouse lawyer on speed. She said, I feel that remaining in foster care is not safe for my physical, mental, and emotional well-being. I feel that I have been abused by the very system that I had asked for help. In fact, in the face of this blistering defense, and perhaps fearful of adverse publicity, DSHS officials backed down. But Brianna would have no luck with anyone who questioned her integrity. Instead, she moved in with another evergreen high school family. They made Brianna part of the family. They cleared out the study so she could have her own room and gave her an allowance of $10 a week, a stereo for Christmas. But 5 months later, Brianna called 911 and accused the husband of spying on her. There were cameras in the light fixtures in her room, and he had been making videotapes of her. She also claimed he exposed himself to her and to his 2 young daughters. Police ultimately concluded that Brianna's accusations were groundless. The wife was outraged, and she said, the state could have taken away my family because of her lies. The wife was outraged. She could have wiped my family out. Once again, Brianna was back on the streets. But a few weeks later, in May 1999, she scored her biggest triumph yet. She persuaded a Portland police officer to take her into his home. A 7-year veteran on the force, he heard a lot of stories from a lot of street kids, but something about Brianna touched him. She was respectful and polite. She was a student at Evergreen, and her story was so pathetic and mysterious that he decided to take a chance. It was the ultimate way of being able to help someone, which is why I'm in this business in the first place, he said. He and his wife bought her clothes, shoes, and helped her pay for summer school. He gamely tried to track down traces of her mother and father. He said he just kept running into dead ends. Throughout his turmoil, Brianna remained determined, even obsessed with establishing her identity. She wrote a 6-page letter to the Washington governor asking his support in obtaining a Social Security number. She met with a detective from Daphne, Alabama. The Mobile Register wrote an article about her, and far from obscuring her origins, Brianna was flaunting them, even going so far as to call the Montel Williams show about doing an on-the-air session with a psychic. Brianna Stewart graduated from high school in June of 2000. She wrote a letter to an advocate at Greenhouse, a Portland drop-in center run by the Salvation Army. "Thanks for all your help. I really appreciate all the great advice and verbal kicks in the arse when I needed it." After she graduated, however, Brianna's need for a Social Security number grew more acute. Without it, she could not work legally, nor could she apply for financial aid for college. She approached a Portland lawyer who, with a reputation as a champion of the underdog, it appears that he provided her with considerable support. He lent her a cell phone and subsidized a visit she took to the University of Montana as a prospective student. Now, before he petitioned for the feds for a Social Security number, however, he wanted to cover his bases. He asked Brianna to submit her fingerprints to the FBI. So why did Brianna agree to this? Did she think the check would come up clean? Or had she somehow convinced herself she really was Brianna Stewart? Either way, the results, when they came back, ripped Brianna's identity to shreds. According to the FBI, the fingerprints belonged to one Treva Thornberry, 31 years old, and was arrested in Altoona, Pennsylvania in 1996 for making a false police report. She said to her lawyer, "I can't believe it. There must be some mistake." Shocked or feigning shock, Brianna stormed out of the lawyer's office and went to Greenhouse, where she told an advocate about her latest setback. Outwardly, he was sympathetic, but his pulse was racing. Until then, he had swallowed his misgivings about Brianna's stories. But scanning the FBI printout, his smoldering suspicions burst into flames. He knew Brianna had sent a man to jail for statutory rape, a conviction whose legal basis now seemed doubtful, to say the least. A few days later, he took a fateful step, a step that no one else had taken since Brianna first arrived in the Portland area. He called the police. Brianna's charade, which had escaped detection for almost 4 years, was now beginning to unravel at the hands of the same Vancouver detective who nabbed the C-Tran guard in 1998. The detective was fooled once. He wouldn't be fooled again. Over the next 3 months, he dug through police reports, child welfare records, and an FBI dossier to piece together a remarkable puzzle. Fingerprints revealed that Brianna Stewart, a.k.a. Treva Thornberry, was born May 18, 1969, in Wichita Falls, Texas. She grew up in the one-light town of Electra, Texas, the youngest daughter of Carl Thornberry, a 6th-grade dropout and an illiterate. He was a hard-scrabble oilman, and his wife Patsy, she was the baby of the family. She was Daddy's favorite girl, and she did everything with him. But on December 19th, at the age of 16, Treva accused her father of putting a gun to her head and raping her. That blindsided the whole family. There were holes in her story, however, and prosecutors dropped the case after she said in court that the man who raped her was not her father. Carl Thornberry has always maintained his innocence, and Carl said he believes that the real culprit was a member of one of several area churches that Treva attended. He let her out about a block from home that night. Her clothes were torn and muddy. Her face was red. She was in terrible shape. Patsy Thornberry likened some of Treva's church friends at the time to a cult. After she got involved with those people, she started calling every man Dad. And 3 of Treva's sisters all insist that their father was incapable of such an act. One sister said, "My father wouldn't hurt a fly. It was like a knife in his heart." Nevertheless, there was an ugly secret lurking in the Thornberry household. The 3 sisters and Treva were all repeatedly molested by their uncle. As often happens in child abuse cases, the girls never told their parents, and the uncle is now dead. Child welfare officials put Treva in foster care, and in May 1986, she was committed to a state mental hospital. Later, she moved to a girls' home in Fort Worth, where she graduated from high school in 1987. Her mother and one of her sisters attended her graduation, but Treva was standoffish and hardly acknowledged them. When she turned 18, she left home and bounced around the streets of Fort Worth. Treva visited one of her sisters in Wichita Falls. It was an awkward visit. Treva told stories about ritual abuse, drinking blood, and making sacrifices, and left the next day. No one from her family ever saw her again. Over the next decade, according to court documents, Treva posed as a teenager from coast to coast, peddling dark tales of abduction, satanic cults, and sexual abuse. Excuse me, guys. In 1992, when she was 23 years old, she told Corvallis police she was Kylie Smith, 19 years, and that her father had forced her into his car and raped her. The following year, she claimed a Portland police officer was her father and accused him of sexually assaulting her. In 1994, she was Carol Leanne Davis in Cura d'Alene, Idaho. In 1995, she was Emily Cara Williams in Texas. And in August 1996, she was 16-year-old Stephanie Lewis in Altoona, Pennsylvania. In Altoona, however, her story backfired. While she was staying at a youth shelter, a child welfare worker figured out she was actually Treva Thornberry, the age 27 years. Treva pleaded guilty to filing a false police report and spent 9 days in jail. Shortly thereafter, she returned to the Pacific Northwest as 16-year-old Brianna Stewart. On March 22, 2001, Detective Smith confronted Brianna with the evidence, identifying her as Treva. Brianna, with the evidence, Brianna denied everything. The FBI report was a clerical error. Smith ticked off his other evidence, dental records and photographs, but Brianna stuck to her story. "I am me," she told him as he put her under arrest. I can remember being me since I was 4 years old." The game was up, but Brianna would not abandon the pretense, even as the deputy took her to the Clark County Jail. The prosecutor says she would probably serve 5 years in prison if convicted on all counts. Several people who knew Brianna Stewart, including those with the little sympathy for her, are convinced that her biggest victim was herself. One Evergreen mom said, "I honestly think she believed her own stories." One individual who had extensive contact with her said, "I believe Brianna Stewart is telling the truth, her truth. There is no fraud, in my opinion. This is who she thinks she is." The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association does recognize a kind of hysteria known as dissociative fugue, characterized by the total obliteration of a person's identity, often coupled with the assumption of a new one. Such cases are rare, but they do occur, usually as a way to escape intolerable conflict. Some patients cling to their new identity in an unshakable way. Oddly enough, Carl Thornberry says Treva would call home from time to time, but pretend to be someone else. I told her, I know you're Treva. I know your voice. You're my little girl. And she'd say, I'm not. I wish I was. I said, you're still Treva and you'll always be. All of this drove us both crazy. Meanwhile, Brianna Stewart continues to maintain her innocence. Last month, she demanded a blood test to compare her DNA to that of Carl and Patsy Thornberry, a test she insists will prove she is an abductee, an amnesiac, a runaway, anything but the little girl from Electra. Her story, stranger than fiction, plotline has led to a Hollywood entertainment company to buy movie rights from her evergreen high school homecoming date. It has also given those who knew her much to ponder. This is the story of a young woman who ended up on the streets through no fault of her own, referring to a mental health system that is less protective of those older than 18. To survive, be safe, she had to move from one system to the other. Her mother said, what she has done is wrong, but she's not just a common criminal. Brianna Stewart was convicted of perjury, theft, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. All right, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments down below. Should she have gotten more than 3 years? Should she not have gotten anything at all? Let me know down below. Listen, if you guys haven't already done so, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Hit the thumbs up button and the notification bell so you know the next time I upload a video. Until next time, guys, peace.